Welcome to the Learning Curve. I'm your host, Julia McLeod, and I am grateful to have you with us today. Before we begin, I'd like to open our time together in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Loving God, we thank you for the gift of learning and for the educators who guide young people with care, wisdom, and compassion. As we gather today, we ask for your Spirit to be present in our conversation. Guide our minds towards clarity, our hearts towards understanding, and our actions towards serving students with dignity and love. Bless all who teach, lead, and support learning in our Catholic community. May our work reflect your truth and light, and may we always seek to nurture the full potential of every child entrusted to us. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. As we begin, we acknowledge that we are recording this episode on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional and ancestral lands of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. We honor the First Peoples who have lived, learned, and created knowledge on this land since time immemorial, and we are grateful for their stewardship, their traditions, and their teachings. As educators, we commit ourselves to the work of reconciliation by building relationships, deepening understanding, and creating learning that reflects truth, respect, and partnership. Today, I'm joined by Rachel French, international educator, consultant, and co-author of Concept-Based Inquiry in Action. Together, we're exploring how concept-based inquiry aligns with Alberta's new curriculum and how inquiry models can support teachers in planning and assessment that leads to deeper, more meaningful learning. Let's dive in. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Learning Curve podcast with Edmonton Catholic Schools. Today, we are so lucky to have Rachel French with us today. Rachel is the Director of Professional Learning International, or PLI, a company she founded to support international schools and educators in accessing leading professional development opportunities. Through PLI, Rachel French is now the sole provider of the annual Dr. Lynn Erickson and Dr. Lois A. Lanning Certification Institute for Concept-Based Curriculum and Instruction Trainers and presenters. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So we'll just start off with a quick introduction. Can you tell us about your background and what led you to pursue a career in education?
Absolutely. So I kind of got into education by mistake, I guess. I originally went to university and studied psychology, and I decided that I wanted to be an educational psychologist. And as part of the requirement for that, before you go on to do your master's and your PhD, you need to have some classroom experience. So then I did a diploma in teaching to get into the classroom. And I got into the classroom and absolutely loved it and just felt that that was the right place for me and where I wanted to stay. But it's also a funny connection, I guess, to my parents because my mother was a teacher and my father worked as eventually in his job, he worked with adults training in business and coaching in business and doing workshops for business leaders and government organizations. And so I've now stepped into a role as a full-time educational consultant. So I'm almost doing what both of my parents did in combining the education side with the training and consulting side.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing it. It's always interesting to hear from all my guests. It seems to come full circle and everyone has a connection to education. We've all been through an education system of some kind. So it's wonderful to hear these stories. Now, in the work that you do, can you provide us an overview of what you work on, what your area of expertise is?
Sure. So I went through working in New Zealand and then moved into an international education context for a few years, first working in Brazil and then working in Egypt and Germany. And so I actually came across the International Baccalaureate program, which is a concept-based program and an inquiry-based approach, which got me really interested in how do we use concepts to help students build understanding. And I came to follow the work of Dr. Lynn Erickson and Dr. Lois Lanning and went on to do their Trainer Certification Institute, which, as you mentioned, they now lead since they have retired. And it really opened my eyes to what was possible in the classroom and what students were capable of and how important it was for us as educators to be really clear on what we wanted our students to understand, know, and be able to do and how we could impact education. So now I work full-time time as an educational consultant specializing in concept-based inquiry. I actually went on then with a colleague from the Trainer Certification Institute, Carla Marshall, to co-author a book called Concept-Based Inquiry in Action. And in that book, it was really our own journey to articulate lots of strategies for teachers that they could use in the classroom that were really practical to help students build to understanding themselves and really see patterns and make connections so that they could make sense of and own their learning. So that's pretty much my days. Now I work in New Zealand in a very small town. I do a lot of work online with teachers. Pretty much every day of the week, I have coaching calls with teachers from around the world in different formats from our online course and through our membership program. And then every couple of months, I do an overseas trip and travel and do workshops, which I absolutely love because it gets me back face to face with educators from all over the world.
Excellent. And I can attest that the concept-based inquiry and action book that you wrote with Carla Marshall is absolutely fantastic for teachers. I've definitely used it in my own practice. There's a wonderful planning guide at the back of the book that all of the strategies and the inquiry overlays into to help you plan these units. So definitely do recommend for any of our listeners. And I'll link it in the description for the episode. Let's go a bit deeper into this area of expertise, this concept-based inquiry. And before we talk about concepts, let's talk about inquiry learning. So what's your definition or understanding of inquiry learning, and how does it relate to a concept of learning to learn? I just recorded a podcast a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Jesse Wilcox from the University of Iowa, and he really talks about this idea of learning to learn and teaching our students that. So again, how does inquiry learning support this idea of learning to learn?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that Carla and I defined inquiry learning is driving learning through questions. And those questions can be on the part of the teacher or of the student, but we're really designing all of our learning experiences to be answering some big questions. How does that relate to learning to learn is a really interesting question. I think they're very complementary approaches. And in the model of inquiry that Carla and I developed, we go through a series of phases to help students to build to understanding and then transfer learning. And those phases are to engage students, to help them focus and build an understanding of an individual concept before they're expected to explore relationships between concepts, then to investigate, which is your research phase of the inquiry, to organize their thinking, to help them see patterns and make connections, then to generalize, which is building their own understanding and articulating the understanding in their own words, and then finally to transfer learning. But there was one more piece that we wanted to include in our inquiry cycle that we didn't really feel fit at the end, and that was reflection. And to me, reflection is a really big part of learning to learn. And we actually put reflection around the outside of the model of inquiry because I genuinely believe that it's a part of every single phase. And that's the learning to learn piece where we need to be helping students build metacognitive strategies, be very much aware of what are the challenges in this task. What steps could I take to solve this problem? What do I do if I fail in solving a problem? How do I pick that up and learn from that and see that as an opportunity to learn? So that learning to learn is a very complementary approach. And in actual fact, if students are intentional about integrating learning to learn strategies into their classroom, they can utilize concept-based inquiry strategies to help students actually articulate what they're doing through that learning to learn and be articulating the strategies of a learner as part of a conceptual understanding. So definitely slightly different, but two very complementary approaches.
It sounds from your description of your inquiry learning cycle that students are really getting an opportunity to think, and that thinking's at the forefront of the entire cycle in every step. And reflection is truly an anchor of that thinking and why it's overlaid into every step of the inquiry cycle. Another big component that I've read about your work and Lynn Erickson and Lois Lanning is conceptual understanding. And how does this fit into inquiry?
So if you want to reach conceptual understanding, you could use a very direct instruction approach to that, or you can use an inquiry approach to that. And we advocate for using an inquiry approach because I believe that it really honors students' agency. So concept-based inquiry is really about bringing together the two approaches to learning and saying we want to use our driving questions to help students notice relationships between different examples. We call them our case studies. So we look at examples. They might be specific pieces of history that we want our students to deeply understand that's significant to our local region or to the country's history or even on a global scale. Then we ask them to notice how is this similar or different to another event in history. And by doing that, they can start to notice patterns and build an understanding that's not locked into a specific time and place that we've studied, but something that's a bigger idea that will help us to understand other historical case studies, but will also help us to understand and possibly look for solutions for problems that they'll come up against in the future.
It sounds like that approach also lends itself really well to cross-curricular learning. We're uncovering these big ideas, and then how can we apply it, maybe not only in science, but how does that relate to mathematics or even the world of physics? Would you like to share with us a bit more about concepts and how concepts help unite these pieces?
Sure. So the interesting thing about concepts is that our students really can't understand a concept unless they see examples of it. But concepts are these bigger, transferable ideas. So a concept is timeless, it's universal, it's abstract to different degrees, and it provides a mental framework for understanding different examples. Now, when students their whole world is conceptual because they're constructing meaning, they're figuring out names for groups of things and how we use that. But in education, all too often, as they go up through the grade levels, the factual level becomes so heavy that they almost start to disengage again. And that's where we see that kind of motivation drop off. But if we can help use that factual level as a basis for understanding bigger conceptual ideas, we help students to see the relevance and the meaning. So Dr. Lynn Erickson provided a framework to help us understand that called the structure of knowledge. And she explained that we need to begin our units at a topic level. So what is the topic? What is the content that we want our students to understand? And then from that topic, which will be supported by lots of factual examples, we draw out concepts. And these are the abstract, universal, timeless ideas. And then from those concepts, we don't just stop there and say, hey, we're exploring change or we're exploring migration. We actually look at, well, what's the relationship between change and migration? And we articulate relationships between two or more concepts to come up with big ideas.
Wonderful. Could you tell me more about how this could look in the classroom? What are some strategies or ideas for how teachers can frame those big concepts through activities and inquiry strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fantastic news for all of your teachers is that a lot of their work to articulate understandings has already been done in your curriculum. So you've got lots of understandings articulated there for you. You don't have to write them for yourself, which is a huge leg up. People all over the world are kind of scrambling to figure out what do we want our students to understand, but that work has been done to articulate that for you. So now what we need to do is say, well, if that's what I want my students to understand, and I've got some supporting knowledge and skills here, what questions do I need to ask in order to help students to reach those understandings for themselves? And they may not articulate it in the same words that you have in your curriculum, but we want them to reach those big ideas and be able to express some of those big ideas for themselves in their own language. So we begin with those big ideas and we design questions. And there's really 4 types of questions that we work on. The first is our concept formation questions. So we need to be able to say, if this is a big idea that I want students to understand, or this is the understanding I'm working towards, what concepts in those understandings might be new to students? And you might say, okay, well, this group of students, we've got this concept of community, or we've got this concept of ecosystem, or we've got a concept of migration was the example I gave earlier. That might be a new concept to them, or it might be a concept where we don't all have a shared understanding as a class. So we ask some concept formation questions like, what is migration? What are ecosystems? And from there, we help students to use a range of strategies to build their understanding. We call those concept formation strategies. Then we also have our factual questions. So our factual questions are designed to give students examples of concepts. And that might include something like, if we're sticking with the ecosystems example, we might say, okay, so we want our students to build to an understanding of ecosystems, but also of the relationship between predator and prey in an ecosystem and how that's balanced within a food chain. So we're going to ask some factual examples, like many of you might have seen the video about the wolves in the Yellowstone National Park. Our factual questions would be things like, what happens when wolves were reintroduced to the Yellowstone National Park? Or what happened when a particular species, what happened in New Zealand many years ago, the moa was extinct. So what happened to the ecosystem when the moa became extinct? What happened to the balance in the ecosystem when rabbits were introduced to ecosystem. So they're factual because we're looking at the example or introduction of one specific species into a very specific ecosystem at a specific time in history. But those factual questions provide us with very concrete examples of the problems that may introduce, or in the case of the wolves in the Yellowstone National Park, some of the solutions that it provided. And then so that's our factual, so we've got our concept formation and our factual questions. And then the next one is our conceptual questions. And this is where we often stop short. We finish with our factual questions, students write a report about a particular ecosystem, and we assume that they understand ecosystems as a whole. But we want to go one step further than that by asking a conceptual question. So the conceptual question might be something like, what happens when a new predator is introduced to an ecosystem? Or in fact, what happens when a new species is introduced to an ecosystem? And then we can come up with an understanding that when new species are introduced to an ecosystem, it often disrupts the balance within that ecosystem. So that's a bigger, timeless idea. Then that also provides a little bit of a warning, right, for history. We didn't learn from that probably fast enough in history. We kept reintroducing species as colonization happened. Oh, we'll bring another one to solve the problem that we just introduced. But if students deeply understand that, then as they go forward in the future, if there's an opportunity to introduce a new species to eradicate another, they're going to be much more aware, well, actually, there's a whole lot of potential unforeseen problems there. Let's think that through. Let's see, maybe in the case of the Yellowstone National Park, it was done strategically because there was an imbalance in that ecosystem. But we've then got something that we can hold on to and transfer to different specific ecosystems. And then the final type of question is our debatable question. And our debatable question has no right or wrong answer, but we want students to be able to defend a stance or justify their thinking. And so we might ask a question like, should humans have reintroduced wolves to the Yellowstone National Park? Why or why not? Defend your stance. To what extent was there risk involved? And those debatable questions give students the opportunity to do just that. So concept-based, going back to your original question, you asked me, how can concept-based inquiry support teachers as they're planning in this way? Using that questioning framework provides a really intentional decision-making process for teachers in terms of what questions am I going to ask if this is the understanding that I'm working to. I'm clear on my understanding, so how will I design specific learning engagements to reach that understanding?
Wonderful. That explanation was so comprehensive. I just want to back up for our listeners. So the curriculum that we're living in Alberta, and between two curriculums, we have our old curriculum and our new curriculum. So what Rachel is referencing is our new curriculum, the structure of our new curriculum that will be a kindergarten to grade 12 framework. So even if you're not yet experiencing the new Alberta curriculum, you soon will, because it will be the same framework. But the big difference between our old curriculum and our new curriculum is we had these learning outcomes where it was up to the teacher to break apart what are the knowledge pieces the students need to know, what is their understanding that they need to know, and what are the skills and procedures that they need to be able to engage with, so be able to understand and be able to do. Whereas our new curriculum, the heavy lifting is done for us. We are very clearly, through our cusps, told what it is students need to know, understand, and be able to do. So now, as what I would encourage you to do, our listeners who are planning with new curriculum, is take that band of cusps, look at the understanding, look at the knowledge and the skills and procedures, and as Rachel was depicting, what are some questions you could ask students to prompt them in revealing what do they truly understand as you're working through that unit of study.
And we also recommend for teachers, as they're going through and engaging with that process, of pausing and labeling for themselves, is this a factual question? Is this a conceptual question? Is it concept formation, or is it debatable? And that helps you to reflect to say, am I even asking a conceptual question? Or sometimes you might have 3 conceptual questions and no factual questions, and go, actually, what would the case studies be? What are the examples that we need to explore and able to see those patterns? So just putting a little label at the end, either writing the word or just a letter or symbol to indicate whether you've designed concept formation, factual, conceptual, or debatable questions, can help you to reflect and make sure you've got a good balance in your curriculum.
Wonderful. So my role is assessment and reporting consultant for my division. So we often talk to teachers about anything and everything assessment. But thinking about this planning framework, thinking about this method of delivery of instruction and engaging students through inquiry processes and questions, where does assessment come in, or where does it live in your opinion?
Oh, great question. So let's first talk about pre-assessment, because I think that assessment a very underutilized tool. So it's important in that engage phase when we're starting to share some examples, maybe have some common learning engagements, that teachers are very aware that assessment needs to start there and that we need to be looking for specifically misconceptions and conceptions that they have about a topic. Now, the research shows that misconceptions can be very difficult to disrupt. Students will hold on to misconceptions where they can and just kind of slot it in with any new learning. So we need to be mindful of those misconceptions and address them specifically. We also need to be aware of the student in the group that actually maybe knows more than you do about a particular topic because it's something that they're really passionate about, maybe something that they've already visited, particular museums or places, and just frankly know a lot about. So what do we want to do to extend their understanding or their knowledge and skills within that unit as well? So I would say that's the place that assessment starts. In the focus phase, we actually really want to be assessing for, do students have a understanding of this concept and how can we build a shared understanding and articulate that? As students are investigating, that's where the assessing their skills becomes really important. Do they actually have the research skills or the communication skills required to be successful in that phase? And at that point, we can pause and we can actually do some really structured mini lessons to up their skills or to write understandings that are based on skills. So if students are finding it hard to develop a research question, then maybe we actually need to articulate what it is in terms of an understanding that researchers do when they build their questions. Or maybe we need to help them learn how to find keywords in a particular text. So that is the formative assessment that's ongoing. But ultimately, in a concept-based classroom, there's much less emphasis on a really big final summative task. It's actually focused on each time students form a generalization or articulate a conceptual understanding in their own words, we're assessing what have you understood to this point. So we design assessment tasks where students actually are invited to answer a conceptual question, complete a sentence frame, and tell us what do they understand. And then as teachers, we encourage groups to come together and take an opportunity to moderate the understandings and just say, what do you think of this understanding? Does it demonstrate an understanding of a bigger idea that we want to work towards? Of course, it shouldn't be the same language that we have necessarily in a curriculum. It's students' own expression of that understanding and to be able to check, are they building understanding as they go through? So we call it generalizing, which is really just answering what's the big idea, answering your conceptual questions to build to that conceptual understanding. And that's a very important part of assessment in a concept-based classroom. And then we also provide opportunities for transfer, which provide another opportunity to assess, have they retained that learning? Are they able to apply it to new situations? So I think since I've learned more about concept-based, assessment has become much more embedded through the whole learning process and a very important part of me pausing and going, oh, okay, they didn't necessarily demonstrate understanding today. So maybe I didn't share enough examples, or maybe the examples they looked at didn't provided an unbalanced perspective and I need to introduce a different kind of case study. Because sometimes students will overgeneralize. They might say something like, a good example we had once with students, migration is always a choice. But they weren't introduced to any examples of migration where it was forced migration for slavery or other purposes. And so we needed to go back and say, they need to see some more examples of migration here around slavery and refugees and really be able to say in what circumstances may it not be a choice. So when students can articulate their understanding, it helps us to really have that information about, have they got it, or do we need to actually go back and look at some more examples for that?
What you said aligns with what we've been talking about as our assessment team, especially in relation to your use of the word formative assessment, really building in that time, allowing for that time to live as long as possible in that formative assessment phase, because that's really where the teacher is going to become informed about misconceptions and inform their next steps, as you had with that migration is always a choice versus them just not having seen an example of forced migration, but also for students to receive feedback on their learning from the teacher, from other peers in the room, even their own feedback and seeing their own misconceptions changing over time. And then I also like how you said that in this framework of concept-based inquiry, summative assessment is less about a final task. We talk about it being a summation of the learning,
Mhm.
or to what depth do students truly understand. And I think that's the beauty about what the Alberta government has said in their guiding framework for new curriculum is we only grade or evaluate and report on the learning outcomes. So if we look at the bands of cusps that can fall under a learning outcome, it can be between one understanding and five understandings.
Mhm.
But we have to make it through all those understandings and determine the depth of understanding of our students before we can truly report a final grade at the end of the year. So
Absolutely.
I really appreciate what you said, and I already see those connections with what our government has put out.
Yeah, and I also think it's really important to really figure out sometimes when we're so focused on grading, we forget to give students another opportunity at something. Whereas with conceptual understandings, if a student has a misconception, so inherently part of the lesson is saying, well, let's look at some more examples. And it gives them an opportunity to show or demonstrate that they can refine their thinking. Because oftentimes in the classroom, if students don't understand something fully, it does come back to they just haven't seen enough examples. So providing more examples can be the difference between a misconception and a really strong understanding. And the beautiful thing about that, you mentioned that peer feedback. One of the best ways I have found to help students if they have overgeneralized or if they haven't understood something, we call it stress testing, where you'll introduce some new examples and see if they fit with the understanding that the students have written. And getting another student to share a case study that they have researched can be the best way of students going, oh, yeah, that is different to some of the examples I had looked at. So I'm going to rewrite my understanding to include some of is to make it applicable to these other case studies as well. And that can be the difference between quite a narrow understanding to going, oh, it's bigger than I realized, and rewriting their understanding. But giving students the opportunity to stress test and refine their understandings is really important and plays into that kind of tension that teachers might have around, but I have to grade them. Well, what are we grading them on? Are we giving them a fair chance to really demonstrate understanding? And too often we see the first attempt as a final.